And it's a little intimidating to be asking questions of the master interviewer. So I thought it would be better to start with a little, it's working, with a little lesson. So I'm going to teach you a little bit of Italian, okay?
Oh, yes. So, yes.
Here's what I want you to repeat after me.
Buenos Aires.
And this is going to be for when you get to Urbino, okay? Dove sono i miei tartufo bianco. Yes.
Do I need to remember all that?
Memorize that.
Okay.
This will get you far when you get there.
Does this get me a dessert or something? It sounds like that.
Don't worry.
Okay, great. Okay. Some of you can tell me in the after dinner drinks what I just did. I will tell you and to all our friends in Urbino, I promise a very intense session with Duolingo before November 22nd.
So, Steve.
Yes.
You went to UCLA.
Yes.
What did you go into college thinking that you were going to do?
Oh. This is an emotional question, so since you want the honest answer. I didn't know. I was, my dad died my first day of college. And
That's intense.
What's that?
That's pretty intense.
That's pretty intense. So I went to UCLA, died September 30th, 1980. That was my first day at UCLA. And we had been stationed in Japan. My dad was 39 years old. It was unexpected, and I was 18. And your life is destroyed. You don't know it. So I didn't know what I wanted to be. I became a workaholic to survive. And to be quite honest, the thing that changed my life and got me here today was one of the ways I made money. I mean, Marlene Colucci knows this. We were close friends with a man named Darren Starr, who was a counselor with us, who created Sex and the City, Melrose Place, 90210, but he was just one of my best friends. And I became a kind of grunt and runaround person for a rich family in Beverly Hills, 702 North Beverly Drive, Beverly Hills, California. And there were two daughters. I tutored them, and one of them was president of the Beverly Hills High School. And that became somewhat of the architecture of Beverly Hills 90210. For Darren, who used to come over and hang out, he was from Potomac, Maryland. He knew nothing about Beverly Hills, but I knew about the backside. So I just struggled, lived in a gusher, and I worked with professors on their research projects because I was cheap, and there were not many undergraduates who wanted to do it. So I just threw myself. My first project was garbology and looking at the incidence of alcoholism in Jewish communities by going through people's garbage. So I didn't know where I was going to end up, is the true story.
And what did you major in? What were you thinking at the time?
Political science, economics, and I just liked getting people. I became president of the Honors College, and I began organizing salon dinners.
So you were doing that in
No,
UCLA?
I began having like people together who were interesting, you could get fed, and I could find a faculty sponsor to pay for it. That's essentially been my life.
I hope you were peddling Darren Starr while you were at it. So how did you end up here? Tell me about here in Washington.
These are really complicated questions. I had outgrown Los Angeles. I was director for many years at the Japan America Society of Southern California. You think back to the mid-1980s, my organization was the forefront of Japanese investment to the United States. Peter Uberoth. It's interesting, the Olympics are going back to LA. I worked for Peter Uberoth as a student, in the LA Olympics years ago. And Jim Fallows knew about this. The Japan America Society was sort of a how about and passive business card and Ikebana club, but I was obsessed with like complicated people. Like Jim Fallows was a toxic guy to know if you were a Japan America Society director. He was considered a Japan basher, and I became convinced that by bringing in the complicated people, it would drive up our membership, people would pay tickets to come to things, and I was right. So, drama sells. And I figured that my life track was to become president of the LA World Affairs Council. That was going to be the pinnacle of my career. And then who was it? President Bush lost. And so the guy who was president of the World Affairs Council didn't come back to Washington. So I got job stuck. And make a long story short, Bill Clinton won. Boris Yeltsin and his government in Russia were melting down. And President Nixon was convinced that something had to be done to save Russia. And who called President Nixon but Bill Clinton and said, come talk to me. And Nixon had decided that Japan was the only nation in the world that could do anything to save Russia at that moment, but they were still technically at war since they never had a peace treaty after World War II. And so head of the Nixon Library called me and said, Steve, you've met President Nixon. I'd organized a thing with Nixon. It's kind of complicated, my Nixon story. I was never a Nixonian or a groupie of Nixon or the Republicans, but I was known as the Japan guy in Southern California. And so they called me and said, President Nixon wants to meet you. And so I flew to Washington, hung out with President Nixon, and the same day he met President Clinton. And I was hired by them to organize Nixon's last trip to Japan, which got the Japanese to give the Russians an aid. We succeeded. And we succeeded so well that Nixon said, want to go to Washington and head the Nixon Center for Peace and Freedom. It was not a good title to have for an organization, but I did do that, and that was my first job. So I moved to Washington because I helped save Russia.
I find this so fascinating because you've had such a circuitous route to journalism. Nothing about
I shouldn't be a journalist.
Nothing of what you just described comes anywhere close to journalism. So how did you?
I did edit the UCLA Undergraduate Review.
Do you think of yourself now? And did you think of yourself, at what point in your career did you start thinking of yourself as a journalist? And do you think of yourself now as a journalist or as an entrepreneur?
Both. I think David Bradley, and I mentioned him because he did have it, David Bradley was on my board at the New America Foundation. The late Ted Halstead was my friend. I was the executive vice president of this. And I started a blog called the Washington Note. And
I'm building up to that.
The Washington Note used to be a big deal, but it's important because I looked at journalism and op-ed pages and the editorial. We had the most successful think tank at that time in terms, if you measured the number of people that were being published in the Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, we were killing all of you in town. We were the number one, that was, not you guys, but other think tanks. But I still looked at the journalism industry as a cartel that was involved with intellectual control, and I just hated it. And so even though as successful we were, I hated being blocked. And so blogging became part of this.
What do you mean when you say being blocked?
There were just a lot of good ideas that were not making it through the biases of the thing. And if you're going to roll a bowling ball through, status quo thinking, you have to take risks, and risks involve not having to worry about Senate confirmation hearings or what your next job is going to be. And I happened to be good at parties. And I remember David Bradley was on Ted Halstead's stairs and said, if you ever want a job in journalism, call me. And that's what happened. And so I eventually, went from being a blogger and a party guy to, a person who wrote for The Atlantic, but also helped work with a woman named Elizabeth Baker Keffer at David's direction and helped create essentially the editorial events industry. But so I kind of look at myself, there's entrepreneurship there, but there's also, I think journalism needs in my book, is a wider aperture activity. And it doesn't mean you're not going to have dispassionate distance from your writing, or not find ways to have dispassionate objectivity, or you can be in the side we've helped launch this. So I think I've been in journalism before I realized I was in journalism, and that's the real story.
What I find, my first memory of you is reading the Washington Note. I just started covering the State Department in 2006 and covering Condoleezza Rice, and I read the Washington Note whenever it published because it gave me ideas of what I wanted to push forward with. It was wonderful. And then I went to one of your salon dinners, and I remember being at the time enamored with your ability to extract, to talk to people, to interview people. You're a master when it comes to that. And what Steve does is he puts the weirdest people you can imagine and the most stiff, uptight people at ease. And he was there talking to some Israeli diplomat at this salon dinner, and this was a really stiff guy who was there with the Jordanian prince, who was the ambassador at the time. And Steve is saying to them, why don't you show a little leg and tell us a little bit more about that? You kept using the phrase, show a little leg. And I'm like, why is he using a sex phrase to these diplomats?
But did it work?
It kind of did. So talk to us little bit about just how do you interview? How do you ask questions? Do you look first to put people at ease? Do you look to be provocative? What are you going into these sessions thinking first?
I believe in creative and combative civility. That
What the hell does that mean?
it means that it is useful with a smile, with a gesture, to ask the tough questions and create a climate where someone is going to reveal something or talk about things in a more serious way than they're not. This is the most risk-averse town in the world. I mean, there are people that, jump at things, but, fundamentally, everybody's watching their back, kind of looking at, how to figure out what their next position is going to be and whatnot. And if you're going to make this happen, I think part of it is provoking. I love the notion provocation. So if many of you have been to my dinner, I ask people, imagine during the reception I went to you and I said, I don't want you to reinvent the wheel or say what we always know. I want you to kind of give us something that's new. And I plan you to go around and get 4 or 5 people. Say, I want you to provoke us, offer a provocation this evening that helps us think big. This is the stuff that Paul DeBar stole from me to get these nuclear weapons people at Los Alamos to open up, right? So, and it's just weird how it works.
What was the worst dinner you ever had where where your interviewees were giving you nothing back, and what did you do?
I've never had a bad dinner.
I do not believe you.
It's too bad. I've never had a bad dinner. I think what's interesting, the worst dinners are the ones that feel like they're going to be the worst dinners are the ones that most excite me. Because, and Faryar knows this, I've done some dinners with Faryar where you just don't know how it's going to go. And you've got a couple of people, Faryar has no idea, and he's paying for it. Like, he's like, oh, this is a tightrope walk, and I just think, fundamentally, I find someone in that room that's going to crack the ice and who's going to reveal something, and they set the tone. And I don't think it's not me, I don't think the rooms I've been in have ever failed. But I've been in dinners. This is like my husband says to me. I do have a husband who's not here tonight. He's on a book tour in California. If I go to a bad wedding, I don't like going to weddings, but if I go to a bad wedding, my husband will say, he'll put his arm around me, he says, you may not take over. And I'm often that way at a bad dinner, where I want to take over the dinner and just help the bad moderator understand what to do. So I have not had that.
So let's try the other way then. Who's the interview that you most remember? What's your best one, and tell us why?
I don't, I love all my children.
No.
Helene Cooper, I interviewed Helene Cooper a couple times.
Besides me.
Okay, well, I did interview you once at the Atlantic on the house at Sugar Beach, and I think you were surprised I'd read every word of the book and knew it really well. And so that was big. I think that one of the best interviews, and it was in the film clip, I am not as good as that film clip, just so you all know. It's really, really cool. That's all the good stuff. But there was a night, we were at David and Catherine Bradley's home, and Walter Isaacson, with whom I had a love-hate relationship, he's a very tough guy. But we had a kind of intellectual vibe, and he is also not a kumbaya guy. But he came up to me and I said, I thought I'd done something wrong, because he had this look. And we were up on that second tier at David's home, and he goes, Steve, you've got to interview Kissinger tomorrow. And we're talking, it's like 10 p.m. And I thought he was pissed and quitting this thing. It turns out that was the night that he was told that Steve Jobs was really going to die. And so he was going to get on a plane and fly immediately out to California. And we were running the Atlantic Festival, the Ideas Festival. And so that night I didn't sleep. And I read the entire book on China by Kissinger. From that moment, I left and read the whole thing. And so
Had you met him before?
I'd met Kissinger before. I'd known, because my whole academic career kind of started with Kissinger. Yeah. I don't want to go into deep detail, but I worked for a great Sovietologist at RAND Corporation. It was one of my first jobs as I was trying to survive at UCLA, the RAND UCLA Center for the Study of Soviet International Behavior for Arnold Horlich.
Let's get back to Kissinger.
Yeah. Well, Kissinger wrote a stupid article once in the LA Times about Japan, and it was idiotic. It was just like, Jim Fallows would have exploded. He was writing about something he knew nothing about, and he should never have published this article. So I wrote an article back, or a letter to the LA Times. The first big published thing I wrote on how wrong he was, and he didn't understand the Japanese, parliament, or etc. So I worked for Arnold Horlick, and I found Kissinger's address in his Rolodex, so I sent it to him. I sent my LA Times published article to Henry Kissinger, and I got a really nice note back saying, "Dear Mr. Clemons, thank you." And then down at the bottom of the letter, hand scrawled in this worst scrawl, chicken scratch, was, "Well, how do you lobby Japan at the sub-cabinet level?" And that became my honors thesis. I knew Kissinger, and I remember one of the first big conferences I got Nixon at before I met Nixon later, I was interested in what was going to drive power in a post-Cold War world after the Soviet Union had disappeared. Was it going to be how big your army was or how good your economy was? And Kissinger was on the board of ARCO, Atlantic Richfield Company, and so I knew the chairman of ARCO, and I said, "Can you get Kissinger to waive his $50,000 speaking fee?" $50,000 in 1983-84 is a lot of money. And I said, "Oh, and can you fly him out?" So Kissinger accepted. So I had this conference which led to Scowcroft, Eagleburger, Michael Crichton, James Fallows spoke there, this giant conference. So I knew Kissinger. But were we intimates? No. So that morning when we had this thing on China, it wasn't because it was Kissinger, it was because I wanted to push him and challenge him. And I remember there was a book on strategic confidence or bridging or something. And, we were in the green room, and I said, "I thought, this was not something you believed in." He says, "I would never write anything like that." I said, "Well, that's the title of chapter 8. And he goes, "Well, I'll stand by it then." And it was just interesting to have that encounter with Kissinger in such stressful circumstances. So for me, it wasn't because of who he was, but because it was just a damn hard thing to do, and I survived.
Wow. Do you feel like you got anything out of it?
Yeah.
What?
Resilience of dealing with stress. You and David was sitting in the front row judging me. Do you remember that?
It's a lot like right now.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that the other thing I got out of it is an understanding of the human side of the great foreign policy divas and how fragile some of this is. And it's an interesting thing. We all present it so easy. The truth is we're all humans, make mistakes, you have legacies and people where they're at. But I know the dark side of Kissinger, and I know the good side of Kissinger, and it was interesting to have that encounter with someone.
So this is my last kind of question. You're going to go to Urbino in November, and you're going to get a whole many questions, I can tell you, about the state of America today. They're going to ask you about the state of freedom of speech. They're going to ask you about authoritarian regimes. They're going to ask you about freedom of the press. They're going to ask you what is going on in your country. Have you thought about what you plan to say?
A little bit, but I have to do more. But I'll tell you what I tell people now. I go speak at World Affairs Councils in little towns in America, like Dubuque, Iowa, Bartlesville. There's all people interested. I'll tell them, and perhaps I'm being Pollyannish here, and there's, credit, that what has happened in this moment is the old ways we were doing things began to cease to work for a lot of people. And there's not a consensus in this country. It doesn't matter what side of the political aisle you're on. And so inertia, I used to say before Trump came along or whatever, inertia has been gut punched. There's a lot of inertia in our defense and foreign policy, a lot of inertia in most of our policy areas. When we created New America in 1999, the whole idea of New America Foundation in 1999 was how stagnant and idiotic and detached our policy making, our policy world was from what technology would allow us to do. And so I think that this is an interesting opportunity where inertia has been gut punched and we all have to fight for what matters. And then democracy has to remind itself what it's about. It's not a kumbaya sport. Institutions need to stand up for themselves. Folks on both sides of the aisle have to do this. And it's not, every president wants to be a monarch and the legislature has to stop them and the courts are there, but you have to kind of pull it in. But we can't act like the equation is already over. And so I don't.
I don't know what that last sentence meant. But.
What that meant is it's not a done and finished situation where, I think that no matter where you are in this moment, it's a great opportunity for reinvention and for people who care about something to lobby and, become politically agile and matter in a way that was. I believe that we were trapped in this country by kind of creeping incrementalism that was choking us. And whether you like where we're at right now, I think this is a great opportunity where a lot of that has been knocked away. So we now have to reinvent America's engagement with the world. And it's not going to follow all the same contours. We have to think about what the social contract is at home and how do you afford it? How do you make it work? I think you have to think about education, how you can, all of these things. And it's uncomfortable. I have a series of salon dinners and things I call uncomfortable conversations, where I purposely bring in odd bedfellows to have uncomfortable conversations. America is having an uncomfortable conversation with itself, and I kind of think it's a good thing.
I look forward to hearing your remarks in November. Steve Clemons, everybody.